Chapter 9, Year 4, Part 3. The arrival of January brought an end to Harry's reprieve. All at once he was thrown into a whirlwind of events. Classes resumed, as did Harry's training with the Slytherins, and Rita Skeeter published an article about Hagrid a few days into the new year. Harry sighed as he trudged back to the castle. Comforting Hagrid was no easy feat when the man was determined to wallow in misery. Sure, he had good reasons for being upset. Having been on the receiving end on Rita Skeeter's acid remarks, Harry could commiserate. But still, surely Hagrid's half-giant status couldn't have come as a surprise for most people. Hagrid did, after all, stand out, being twice as tall as any normal man and everything. "Harry?" He stopped when a familiar voice called out to him in the entrance hall. "Yeah?" "Listen," Cedric said, looking serious. "I'd like a word." He glanced around. "Somewhere more private." Harry rubbed his forehead tiredly. He'd rather postpone this meeting, but the secrecy was most unlike Cedric. He probably had something important to say. "Okay," Harry nodded. "I know of an unused classroom near here." Cedric went as far as to cast a few warding spells around the room before he started to talk. "Right, so I've got the egg clue," he began, as if continuing an earlier conversation. "And seeing that I owe you majorly for the dragon tip—" Harry looked up, hardly able to believe his luck. All of his attempts at dealing with the egg had resulted in failure, and he was starting to get really quite nervous, despite the fact that he still had over a month to prepare. "You'll tell me?" he asked, and some incredulity must have shone through in his voice, because Cedric frowned. "Of course I'll tell you. Did you think I'd let you go in blind?" He shook his head. The faith. It's really too flattering, Harry." Harry smiled sheepishly. "Well, I am sort of stealing your thunder, so I wouldn't blame you if you—" "Don't be an idiot," Cedric interrupted, in such a no-nonsense voice that Harry didn't even protest against being called an idiot. "So, that clue. Apparently what we have to do is to listen to it underwater. Then the crazy noise becomes normal words and you can actually understand the instructions." "Which are?" "As far as I understand, something that matters a lot to us will be taken away by the mer people who live in the lake." "There are mer people in the lake?" "And we have to retrieve whatever it is within an hour, which we have to spend underwater." Harry stared at him. "All in a day's work, huh?" Cedric gave a crooked grin. "Don't take my word for it, though. Bring your egg to the prefect's bathroom, it's really nice, and listen to it yourself. The password is Pine Fresh." "Thanks a lot, Cedric," Harry said with feeling. "And I mean, really. Hey, I'd be one fried Hufflepuff by now if you hadn't told me about the dragons, so it's only fair." The other boy smiled. "Besides, I've had some help on this too. Good luck preparing, 'cause working out the clue is just the beginning, you know." The conversation with Cedric marked the start of 3 weeks of frantic research on Harry's part. He now knew what to prepare for, but not how to actually stay alive underwater for an hour. This question preoccupied Harry in most of his waking hours, and even invaded his sleep. Thankfully his friends were helping, even though it couldn't be much fun for them, whatever Anthony said about intellectually challenging tasks. Harry shook his head, bringing himself back to the present. He'd decided to clear his head and take a stroll by the lake, where he'd bumped into Luna. She apparently also figured that a lovely winter afternoon called for a walk, despite the cold temperatures. The conversation had been rather stilted at the beginning, but there was artlessness about Luna that made Harry relax his guard. "How come you're wearing mismatched shoes?" he wondered, looking at Luna's feet. "My shoes seem to have gone somewhere," Luna said, turning her face to the sun and closing her eyes. "I'm sure they'll return soon." Harry frowned. He might be muggle-raised, but he knew that even wizarding shoes didn't tend to walk off on their own. "Did someone take your things and hide them again?" he asked. Luna shook her head. "It's all in good fun," she said, and then glanced at him with a smile. "It's nice of you to worry, but you don't have to, you know. I don't need a rescue. But I would like you as a friend." Harry huffed out a breath, startled anew by her candour. "I didn't mean to interfere or anything," he said. "And of course we can be friends." "Can we?" Luna asked, brightening. "That's good. We can start now, I think. I'm not sure how this is usually done." Neither was Harry. He'd never become friends with anyone by mutual agreement, and he wasn't even sure what a friendship with Luna would entail. But she at the moment seemed keen to tell him about something called an oolgog flamingo, so he just kind of went with it. This outing of his came up in a conversation with Padma the next day. Fourth-year Slytherins had herbology with the Ravenclaws, and Harry usually paired up with his, dare he say it, girlfriend for the lesson. It usually worked out quite well because both were good students and both enjoyed the favour of Professor Sprout. "Harry, I know your chivalry has no bounds, but honestly," Padma said, reaching for another pot of soil, "you can't go about socializing with Loony Lovegood. She's like one of the least cool people in the school." "Yeah, because I have always been Mr. Popular," Harry said, irked. "And her name is Luna." Padma rolled her eyes. "Whatever. Don't say I didn't warn you. But anyway, Harry, you need to share some Slytherin gossip. Tell me, are Draco Malfoy and the Parkinson cow together, or are they just friends?" Harry groaned. "I don't know, and really don't care." Padma shook her head. "You're not good at this at all." But she likely wasn't too upset with Harry for his lack of gossiping skills, because after the lesson she steered him away from the greenhouse by the hand. "So you've been so busy lately. I've hardly seen you, except in class, of course." But they hadn't even made 2 steps towards the castle when an excited Neville flew up to them, clutching a thick book. "Harry, I think I've got it," he said, completely heedless of the moment he was interrupting. "I think I've got it. What you need is gillyweed." After that, time abandoned all pretense of decency and whooshed past with breakneck speed. Just yesterday Harry had been ordering gillyweed from Italy with the help of Blaze's uncle, but now was for some reason already 2 weeks later, and he stood with the other champions and listened to Ludo Bagman explain the particulars of the second task. Quite an incredible and unwelcome development, that. It was a gloomy, windy February morning, not the kind when a lot of people fancied a stroll outside, normally, but today most students from Hogwarts and both visiting schools gathered by the lake shore. The champions displayed a blatant lack of enthusiasm, and Harry believed that they had a damn good reason for that. All this time, while he'd been researching and preparing, he had not realized that what he'd sorely miss would be an actual person, trapped with mer-people in the lake until he got around to saving them. He'd thought it would be another object he'd have to retrieve, but a human being? What if a champion failed at the task? No use dwelling on that, though. Harry knew what he was going to do. Praise be to Neville and his love for herbology. He would just have to do his best. He was as prepared as he was ever going to get. "Now if the champions are ready," Bagman said, rubbing his hands in glee. Percy Weasley, who was replacing Crouch again, looked faintly embarrassed by Bagman's exuberance. 3, 2, 1, go! Harry put gillyweed into his mouth and started chewing. It tasted awful and had slimy texture that made him think of jellyfish. While Harry struggled to swallow the bits and pieces of the magical plant, he watched other champions disappear under water. That half-shark transfiguration was really brave of Victor. Cedric's and Fleur's bobblehead charms were much less interesting. Harry, at this very moment, was developing gills. Feeling himself begin to struggle for breath, Harry plunged into the lake. It was bizarre to have a different organ than his nose to breathe with, but he didn't have time to contemplate that. Looking around the underwater world in interest, everything was very green and blue here, and surreal in its fluidity of movement. Harry dove deeper. He swam between odd, large-leaved water plants, which felt almost like wading through a forest. A school of fish darted past him faster than he could figure out what they were. He was just about to cast the point-me spell when he felt something grab his ankle. A Grindylow was holding on to Harry's leg with brittle fingers, smiling toothily and trying to drag Harry down. "Relatio!" Harry's words came out garbled, but that didn't matter because the Grindylow whined in pain anyway. Its hands appeared to be scalded. "Stupefy!" More water demons were coming. Harry swam quickly away. As far as he remembered, Grindylows dwelled among weeds. Time to get out of the weedy area. The scenery changed as Harry moved forward. Now he was in what seemed to be an underwater valley, and judging by the darkness, not any closer to the surface than before. Something rather large loomed in the distance. A mer-people colony, perhaps? Harry swam closer, cautiously, but still couldn't quite make out what he was seeing. It appeared to be an overturned column lying on the lake bed. No, wait, several stacked columns, but they seemed to be pretty bendy. Oh, hell! Harry stopped in his tracks and began inching backwards. There, lounging in front of him and beginning to uncoil its tentacles, was the giant squid. Harry was not dealing with this. He backed away slowly at first, so as not to disturb the water too much and alert the squid to his presence. Having withdrawn somewhat, he swam as fast as possible to get away from there. Paying no attention to his surroundings, he made a goal out of putting enough distance between himself and the huge mollusk. After a while, Harry's ears discerned strange sounds reaching from somewhere to his left. They reminded him distinctly of the voices he'd heard in the Golden Egg. He advanced in that direction, clutching his wand and remaining on guard, just in case. He'd been fooled once already. However, this time he seemed to have stumbled onto the real thing. The words of the song got clearer as Harry swam through the mer-people village, trying to ignore the suspicious gazes of the inhabitants. It was strange seeing this sort of life. Rough stone houses, domesticated grindylows, and mer-people themselves, so different from their idealized fairy-tale version Harry had grown up with. With their green hair, scaly skin, and yellow teeth, they resembled Grindylows' human-sized cousins. 3 hostages were tied to a mer-person monument in the middle of the town square, all of them in deep sleep. With a start, Harry saw Neville and Hermione. There was also a little girl with the same blonde flowing hair, Fleur flaunted. Right now, of course, the hair was more green than blonde, which only deepened the pallor of the girl's face. Relieved to have finally made it, Harry approached Neville. He hesitated between him and Hermione for a moment, but then remembered that she and Krum were dating, sort of. Neville, on the other hand, could not be any other champion's hostage. The mer-people floated around, pointing and glaring threateningly, but they made no move to hinder Harry in any way as he fiddled with Neville's ropes. The sleeping boy was a dead weight on Harry, once released. Harry tugged him upwards, determined to get out of there once and for bloody all. This underwater adventure had been sort of fun at the very beginning, but now it was getting creepy and exhausting, and Harry was starting to feel distinctly short of breath. "And the second champion returns," Ludo Bagman's voice greeted Harry as he surfaced from the lake, sputtering. "And it's Harry Potter. He's made it back with his hostage in second place. Let's have a round of applause." Once ashore, Harry was directed to Madame Pomfrey. She gave him a blanket and fed him a pepper-up potion, muttering about reckless adventures and dangers to children's health. Harry smiled and waved at Cedric, who sat next to Cho Chang and a little distance away. Victor had still not made it back, and Fleur seemed to be crying. Harry frowned. Did she mess up the task? What happened? It took a little while to fill Neville in. The Gryffindor seemed to be flabbergasted to have taken part in the task, and at the same time flattered that he turned out to be the person Harry would miss most. Harry was sort of surprised to know that too, actually. He wondered who determined these things for the purposes of the task. Which he was, by the way, done with, as in finished. No more second task, ever. "Merlin's beard, it's cold," Neville gasped. Harry didn't really mind. If feeling chilled to the bone was tangible proof that he was done with 2/3 of his tournament, he could definitely cope with this. "You know what's funny?" he said. "You've really saved yourself here. If you hadn't told me about Gillyweed, both of us would have been fish food by now." Neville grinned. "Champions these days. Can't leave anything to them. Got to think of your own rescue plans." "Well, there's always better things to do than go around rescuing random Gryffindors," Harry drawled. "Seriously, though, that was really some spectacular thinking, Nev." Neville actually blushed. "It's no big deal," he said, fidgeting under the blanket. "I didn't actually think of it all by myself. I only remembered because I'd read about it recently. It's a really interesting book. I got it from Professor Moody." "You what?" Harry asked, focusing sharply on Neville. "Got it from Professor Moody?" Neville tried. "And you didn't think to mention it until now?" Neville blinked in confusion. "Well, should I have?" "Harry!" Harry turned around, still absorbed in the conversation with Neville. "Hey, Padma," he said absently. The girl put her hands on her hips. "Honestly, Harry, you've just passed a devilishly tricky task, risking life and limb, and all you can say is, 'Hey, Padma.' I'm not going to hug you, you're all wet, but, well, I'm glad you're all right, and I think you might be getting a high score. They're just taking their time getting the Beauxbatons girl sister out. She didn't make it, apparently." Padma rolled her eyes. "So yes, can you explain to me why I wasn't the person you'd miss above all others?" And suddenly, just like that, a pretty girl transformed into a frightening harpy. Harry's eyes widened. I don't know," he ventured. "I mean, I wasn't the one who made the choice. Cedric and Victor had to rescue Cho and Hermione." Padma flipped her hair back in an exasperated fashion. "For what reason didn't your girlfriend deserve the same attention?" Harry cast around for something to say. He glanced at Neville, only to see him snigger at Harry's expense. "Well, Fleur's hostage was her sister." Harry seized on that fact gleefully. "So, see, I'm not the only one." "Oh, so it's Fleur now, is it?" Padma narrowed her eyes. "Listen." "No, you listen," Padma cried dramatically. "I've noticed you oogle her in that swimsuit." "It's an interesting swimsuit. The only reason why I'm even considering forgiving you is that you've just been through a traumatizing experience," Padma said in clipped notes, and stormed off, probably to complain to Mandy Brocklehurst about Harry's behaviour. Harry became aware of uproarious laughter. The twins weren't even trying to be discreet. "When did you get here?" he asked sulkily. "Oh, a bit ago," George snickered. "And Harry, our friend, this is no way to treat a lady." Fred shook his head. "Go to hell," Harry advised, and then complained, gazing after Padma. "She used to be a lot nicer when we were just friends." More laughter from his considerate, supportive companions served as his only answer. Once the excitement of the second task had worn off a bit, all hostages were returned and the scores counted. Harry tracked down Percy Weasley and asked, putting on a suitably concerned expression, "Your boss is still feeling under the weather, then?" After all, Percy was again here instead of Crouch. At the Yulee ball, Percy had admitted not having seen Crouch for quite a while, which confirmed Harry's belief about him skulking around Hogwarts under invisibility cloak. "Mr. Crouch trusts me to be capable of representing him," Percy said. This did not answer Harry's question. "So you still haven't seen him?" "I receive my instructions by owl, and am perfectly satisfied with such an arrangement," Percy pronounced, the tips of his ears reddening slightly. "If you have some concern to bring up with Mr. Crouch, I can forward your request to him, and— Oh, hello, sir." Moody was limping up to them. Both his eyes, magical and normal, were fixed on Harry. "Inquiring after old Barty, eh, Potter?" "Not really, sir," Harry said. "It's just that he's one of the judges and hasn't been around for a while." More like, hasn't been in the open for a while, according to the map. The man was spending all his time in Hogwarts. "I expect Barty thinks he's got better things to do than putting in an appearance here," Moody snorted. "Off making important decisions. Always a pompous ass, that one." Percy looked scandalized. "With all due respect, sir—" "Oh, don't bother, Weasley," Moody interrupted, waving him off. "Barty knows what I think of him, and that's that. Congratulations on completing the task, by the way, Potter." "Thank you, sir." And that was just peachy, but it was Moody's book that had enabled him to succeed in the first place. Harry somehow didn't think it was a coincidence that Moody just happened to give Neville the book, the one book that contained the answer to the second task. This, in conjunction with Moody's help on the first task, was making Harry's warning bells go off. He glanced at Moody, wondering whether it was a good idea to bring it up. Moody frowned at him. "Run along then, lad. Your friends want to see you, going by the way they're waving." In the end, Harry figured that it would be imprudent to tell Moody anything, but he did discuss the matter with his friends at the next earliest opportunity. Millie looked like she was going to strangle Neville for neglecting to mention where he got the gillyweed information. Hermione, on the other hand, rushed to his defence. "Neville didn't think it was important because, in case you're forgetting, by that point we had decided that Professor Moody was innocent." "Not as innocent as we'd thought, apparently," Harry noted. "All he's done is nudge you in the right direction," Hermione said reasonably. and it's unfair of him to help you over Cedric, but you are the younger champion."
"Maybe he's helping Harry for ideological reasons," Terry suggested. "He's famous for fighting dark wizards, right? Well, maybe he's gone batty in old age and secretly worships Harry for getting rid of the darkest of them all." "Does he have anything to gain?" Anthony questioned. "His actions are suspicious if he derives any profit from helping Harry, but he's only been making sure that Harry can pass the task safely."
"Free cheese is only found in the mousetrap," Blaise said lightly, with the air of one quoting from somewhere. "You're not really falling for this show of altruism, are you?" Terry raised an eyebrow and answered with his own question.
"Has it occurred to you, perhaps, that all of you Slytherins are simply paranoid?"
It had, actually, but Harry was not one to believe in random kindness. No adult, bar Snape on those few occasions when duty forced him to, had ever gone out of their way to assure Harry's well-being, and he didn't see why Moody would do so now. Crouch was definitely not the only one who bore watching. Mindful of the long break before the next task, it was only the end of February now, and the third task wasn't until late June, Harry threw himself into the investigation. He watched the map carefully, on the lookout for Moody as well as Crouch, and soon noticed an oddity that, with time, acquired an eerie feel. Quite simply, Moody never left his office. Harry could not, of course, monitor the map constantly, and he had never checked it in Moody's presence. The risk of exposure to Moody's all-seeing eye was too high, but the map seemed convinced that Moody remained perpetually in his quarters. Crouch, conversely, was still wandering around, although Harry paid less attention to his comings and goings, consumed as he was with trying to catch Moody out of his office. To that end, he came up with a project that would circumvent Moody's magical eye. It would require a lot of time and effort, but it would be worth it in the end, Harry was sure. While Harry had been busy monitoring Crouch and Moody, his friends unearthed other secrets, some of which threw Harry for a loop. "Bagman?" he repeated, staring at the twins in disbelief. "A Death Eater?" "Well, no," Fred said with obvious regret. "But pretty close. An informant of sorts." "He didn't know the people he'd been passing information to were Death Eaters, see?" George explained. "He was cleared by the Wizengamot on grounds of ignorant, general stupidity and being a Quidditch star, if old newspapers are anything to go by." "And it's public record," Fred added gloomily. "Half forgotten, but public. Not exactly blackmail material." "Seriously, what has he done to you?" Harry inquired. "I mean, I'm grateful for the information, but you've been a little too eager about this from the start." The twins sighed, shrugged, exchanged glances, and launched into a tale of the Quidditch World Cup, gambling, and leprechaun gold, which really did not sound pretty. Harry could not help much with that, but he was proud of teaching the twins the daunting and completely impractical as far as duelling went, curse with the incantation of "Donerent mendaces tui muscas conluvievi tibi indextrinari," which roughly translated to "May your lie make flies of the muck-heap infect your right nostril." It was meagre revenge, perhaps, but revenge nonetheless, and the twins' estimation of Harry clearly went up at that bit of creative curse knowledge. Harry didn't confess to the unglamorous truth that he'd obtained that knowledge by spending half his waking hours in the library trying to save his skin from bloodthirsty sixth-year Slytherins. The next portion of explosive information came from Hermione, as Harry sat in that said library, poring over books on magical illusions and deceptions for his fooling Moody's Eye project. Hermione stormed over to his desk and grimly laid out old issues of the Daily Prophet, having apparently taken a page out of the twins' book. "Read," she said in a horrible voice. "Just read it." So Harry did, and soon he understood the reason for the sickened expression on Hermione's face. Crouch had apparently also had connections with Death Eaters in his day. He had not done anything himself, but his son had been convicted and thrown into Azkaban, where he died soon afterwards. The papers might have yellowed with age, but the magical photographs on them were still moving, and the image of Crouch Jr. being led away by Dementors as his father looked coldly on would stay with Harry for quite a while. "Well," Blaise noted flippantly when he'd heard about it, "Crouch is not what you'd call a family man, is he?" Harry was pretty sure that if Hermione and Blaise hadn't been on non-speaking terms as it was, Hermione would have severed all ties with Blaise right there, then and there. "An awful,
awful man," she said. "I think you should go to a teacher with what you know, Harry." Terry, Anthony and Neville seconded that motion, but Harry was still reluctant. There weren't many people he could go to, because he was sure that Blaise and Millie were right. Pretty much any teacher would run to Dumbledore first thing. McGonagall certainly seemed to be in his pocket, and whatever Terry said, Harry was having a hard time imagining Flitwick solving any important issues without involving the ultimate authority in the school. Blaise and Millie had predictably advocated Snape's candidacy. "If he doesn't kill you, he'll do something to help you." But Harry didn't even want to open that can of worms, because a search through the old newspapers, deemed necessary once they proved themselves so useful twice, revealed that Snape, of all people, had Death Eater ties too. Snape was the final straw. Harry had long known that his head of house had a murky past, but who didn't? As far as he could tell, the war hadn't been kind to anyone. Both sides of the war committed atrocities and ruined lives, while those who chose no side stood idly by and let it all happen. Finally, as Blaise was fond of reminding him, history was written by the victors. However, the knowledge that Snape had been a Death Eater still came as a blow, because what the fuck had the man been doing warning Harry about werewolves and other dangers when he had that on his resume? According to old newspaper issues, Snape had actually been a spy for Dumbledore, the headmaster, at Snape's trial. The headmaster at Snape's trial had supported this view and got the potions master released. Dragging any information out of Harry's fellow Slytherins proved to be about as useful as banging his head against a brick wall. He was acquitted, Potter, completely acquitted of everything, and Dumbledore vouched for him, so mind your own business if you know what's good for you. Of course, Snape's post-war record had to be squeaky clean, because his Death Eater involvement was public knowledge. He would not be allowed anywhere near children if there remained grounds for suspecting him. Still, Harry really didn't want his head of house to be a Death Eater, however redeemed, but nobody was asking for his opinion. With all of those revelations, plus the normal class workload and his training on top, it was unsurprising that Harry didn't devote nearly as much attention to Padma as he perhaps ought to have done. He did try to be thoughtful and bought her tons of chocolate to make up for his constant busyness, but he heard of his mistreatment of her with increasing frequency all through the month. "I can't be the only one who's trying to make this relationship work." It wasn't entirely his fault, though, and he wasn't sorry for failing to notice Padma's new shoes either, because who the hell cared? And not for blowing himself up on her minefield of wrong answers, because she left him no right ones. Padma was still very pretty and smelled enticingly of vanilla, but it just wasn't worth it anymore, and Padma seemed to agree, but for reasons of her own and completely different from his. Fleur's swimsuit figured into them somehow. The situation was bound to explode sooner or later, and Harry was faintly surprised that it lasted till the end of March, when nothing had really gone right with them ever since the second task, if not before that. "Harry, I'm tired of waiting for you to recall that you have a girlfriend. The way you just forgot Valentine's Day." "Well, I was a little preoccupied by the second task at that point." "That's not an excuse for everything, Harry. Being a champion doesn't mean it's okay for you to ignore my feelings." "Yes, but it does mean that I'm trying to keep myself alive here." "Oh, so you are saying you have no time for me? Well then, I wish you'd never asked me to that ball at all. Look, honestly, imagining a relationship was a lot better than dating you turned out to be." Yeah, well, that about summed it up for him too. They managed to stay on speaking terms. Just. Harry wasn't sure whether things would ever return to the way they used to be, before this fiasco of a relationship, but he hoped it was possible. Padma had been fun when they were friends. Dating her only screwed everything up, even though there had been fun sides to the relationship too. Well, it was all over now. Freed of the burden of trying to be a good boyfriend, Harry concentrated on his project, working to disguise the Marauders map to look like a page of his defense textbook. Inwardly he feared the moment the general school population would find out about his breakup with Padma, because with him being such a public figure, he was sure that some rather serious shit would hit the fan then. Harry sat in the defense classroom with the rest of his classmates, textbook in hand, pretending to do last-minute revision for the lesson. Blaise and Millie were beside him, chatting between themselves. They threw occasional looks at Harry, but did not disturb him. It was fortunate, because Harry was engaged in something much more important than revision.
His eyes were glued to the map. He'd finally succeeded to make it look as an innocuous page in his textbook. Not an easy bit of spell work by any means. It had been more complicated than disguising his book cover back at Neville's during the summer. But he was proud of the result. Unless someone knew specifically what to look for, they would not recognize the disguised map. That wasn't specially important when Harry wanted to fool someone in possession of a crazy magical eye. Harry scanned the map, trying to sort through hundreds of dots cluttering the hallways. The Harry Potter dot was surrounded by dots labelled with his Slytherin classmates' names. There was nobody else in the defence classroom yet. Harry moved his gaze upward to the second floor, where the defence professor's office was located. The dot labelled Aleister Moody was right there. Curiouser and curiouser. Harry waited patiently, not taking his eyes from the Moody dot. As the time for the defence lesson drew nearer, one way or another, he was solving the mystery today. He jumped when he heard Moody's voice boom from nearby. "Pay attention, you brats, when the lesson is starting. Now, where's that blasted class roll?" Incredulous, Harry raised his eyes. Mad-Eye Moody stood at the front of the classroom, having just walked in through the door, wooden leg, scowling face, magical eye and all. Harry dropped his gaze to the map again, seeking out the defence classroom this time, and there it was, in plain sight. Black on white, all the rest of it, but Bartemius Crouch. Crouch was the only person apart from Harry and his classmates in the defence room, and Harry didn't know what he'd been expecting to see, but it wasn't this. "Potter, I've called your name once already. What are you waiting for?" Moody barked. Except that this wasn't Moody. This was Crouch, and that fact seemed completely outrageous when Harry was staring into Moody's face. Sorry, I'm present, sir," Harry muttered automatically, trying to find a way to somehow make any of this make sense. Crouch's eyes met his, and for a terrifying second it seemed to Harry that he knew. But then Harry blinked and Moody coughed, someone's chair creaked, and Harry felt silly for being so paranoid. Pass your essays up front," Moody demanded. "Anyone who hasn't mentioned the impediment jinx is going to have a detention with Filch for sheer damn stupidity." Harry passed his essay on, without paying attention to Moody's words. Fourth-year defence was quite easy, most of the time. The sixth-year Slytherins had started throwing non-verbal spells at Harry lately. That was something to worry about, not a measly impediment jinx, and certainly not under circumstances such as these. Moody, who was teaching defence, was not Moody, but Crouch. What the hell? Harry stared at the desktop, thinking furiously. The only logical conclusion was that Crouch was pretending to be Moody. However, Harry had seen them both at the same time as recently as the first task. Both Moody and Crouch had been in the audience then. He'd noticed Crouch sneaking about before that. Wait, Crouch had stopped coming to work at about that time, according to Percy Weasley, hadn't he? Okay, possibly Crouch had simply been creeping about Hogwarts before the first task, looking for ways to impersonate Moody, or preparing for it somehow. After the first task, Crouch had stopped coming to work, confined Moody to his office, and started wearing his face instead. What for? Never mind, for some nefarious purpose, no doubt. Harry glanced at Blaise and Millie, wishing they could communicate telepathically. Maybe then they wouldn't just sit there with such carefree expressions, unawares that something momentous had transpired. "Now pair up," Moody snapped, attracting Harry's attention again. "We'll be reviewing the shield charm today." Of course they would be. Was it just Harry's imagination, or Moody was looking at him more often than normally? Harry's concentration was shot, but the shield charm was something he could cast in his sleep, and the remaining part of the class was devoted to a lecture on a curse Harry already knew. He could afford some distraction. He tried not to trail fake Moody with his eyes, looking for signs that this was actually Crouch, and doodled on his parchment instead. He just wanted the lesson to end. Not only did he fear giving himself away, but it was just plain creepy, and someone had to be notified as soon as possible. "What did you say to Millie?" Harry muttered to Blaise, eyeing her retreating back as they packed books and parchment into their bags after class. Now was really not the time for them to quarrel. "There's something—" "Potter!" Moody's voice called from behind them,
and Harry's heart skipped a beat. "Stay behind, will you?" Harry turned around, plastering an apologetic smile onto his face. "I'm sorry, Professor, but I've got to run," he said, inching backwards. Crouch wouldn't dare do anything in public, would he? "I've got detention with Professor Snape right now, so—" He could feel Blaze's surprise radiating off him. Blaze knew perfectly well that Harry didn't have a detention. Harry never got detentions. "Detention, you say?" Crouch muttered. "Yes, sir," Harry nodded, and made several steps backwards. Soon there will be nobody in the classroom but him, Crouch, and Blaze. It did not bode well. "Professor Snape will kill me if I'm late." "Well, Snape can bring it up with me if he likes," Crouch snapped. "Zabini, out. I've got to have a word with Potter here." Blaze threw a sideways look at Harry. Harry shook his head subtly. "But, sir, Harry really does have detention, and Professor Snape is very strict." Harry's instincts alerted him to what was coming before anything else did. He cast Protego at the exact same moment as a jet of red light hit Blaze, and he collapsed on the floor, a mildly surprised expression on his face. Crouch's other stunner bounced off Harry's shield and smashed into the blackboard. Harry darted towards the exit, but Crouch's non-verbal spell got there first, warding the door. "Mulco!" Harry fired, turning around quickly, but he didn't expect one bludgeoning curse to penetrate Crouch's shield, not really. Maybe a barrage of them would. "Mulco Maximus! Protego!" He dove behind a desk, putting a physical boundary between himself and his attacker. The volley of bludgeoning curses made a clear impact against Crouch's shield, but he laughed as he deflected them and sent another non-verbal spell at Harry, a stunner from what Harry could tell. He'd had a lot of those aimed at him in recent past. "Ango!" The choking curse had no more success than the bludgeoning ones, but Moody's voice was savagely amused as Crouch said, "You always were a precocious student, Potter, but you must know you can't win this fight." He punctuated that statement with a series of rapid-fire spells, the last one of which cracked the desk Harry was hiding behind. Harry didn't know what the fuck Crouch was casting, but that wasn't any different from his training, except that this time it was very much for real. He needed something fast, distracting, incapacitating. With a quick banishing charm, he sent the remains of the desk flying at Crouch and threw a vexo at the momentarily distracted man. The curse actually hit its mark. Crouch was thrown violently into the teacher's desk behind him, hitting it with a sickly crunch. But he rolled out of the way of Harry's opportunistic Expelliarmus and fired another curse as Harry dodged. "Protego," Harry muttered. "Aspergo flamme." Crouch's robes caught gratifyingly on fire, but the man chose against battling the flames as Harry had hoped. Instead he roared, "Very well, Potter. If you want to fight like adults do, you'll get your wish." And that was it. Harry's one warning that the kid gloves were coming off, and while it was great that he had proved himself to be a tougher adversary than Crouch had envisaged, the prospect of an all-out duel sent him into a cold sweat. "What the hell do you want with me?" he asked, hoping to maybe distract the man with conversation. "Segrego!" Crouch swerved out of the way of the curse that could have dislocated his arm with agility surprising for a man on a wooden leg, and fired a spell at Harry that sizzled as it went past his ear. At some point, while Harry had been dodging, Crouch extinguished the flames on his person, but the smell of burning clothes still hung in the air. "Don't pretend you don't know, Potter. I've seen it in your mind," Crouch panted, and aimed his wand again. Harry dove behind another stack of desks, dragging Blaze's body with him, because fuck knew what might hit Blaze while he lay there incapacitated. "Serpent Sorcia," Harry whispered, and then in Parseltongue to the resultant snake, "Go bite that man, now!" Together with the snake, he sent another couple of desks and chairs flying at Moody, but Moody dispelled them with a broad swipe of his wand in the air, deflecting them back at Harry. Harry experienced a moment of blind panic and fired an automatic Protego, hoping to stop the barrage of flying furniture from pummeling him and Blaze to death. The desks and chairs sailed past them and collapsed with a thundering noise. Harry's shield faltered for a second, and Moody had curses flying at him. Harry dove to one side, but inadvertently strayed into the path of another. "Fuck," he thought, collapsing on the floor, his whole body bound together by rhythm coiling ropes. He tried to move, but the restraints only wound tighter. Now he was done for. Fuck knew that what would... "Ah!" came Crouch's cry from a little distance away. Harry could not see what was happening from his prone position on the floor, but he got his suspicions confirmed when Crouch continued, "No matter, I've got antivenom in my chambers, and you little snake tricks won't slow me down. Evanesco, now." Moody's face came into view, looming over Harry with a grin. "Irritating little shit, aren't you?" he asked conversationally. "No respect for your elders, although Master will teach you better manners, of course." The man gave a little laugh. Harry kept silent. "Do you have any idea, Potter, how tempting it is to let my wand slip, my mind wander?" Crouch's wand hovered just above Harry's chest. "And perform an unforgivable or two? I'm partial to the cruciatus, although I hide it well." He giggled, which was eerily at odds with Moody's serious, battered face. "Bella didn't hide it well, and she's in Azkaban now. And I'm free, and helping my master, but he does not want me to kill you." That last was said in an almost petulant tone. Harry's brain was refusing to process everything, almost, because... Master? Crouch was... "Master needs you whole and healthy on the summer solstice," Crouch said, pouting. "I offered to kill you for him, but he has better plans, and then he will kill you," Crouch promised. "And now will be rewarded, but now I must stay hidden. I have not yet completed my mission, my missions. And you know something, I know you have found me out. I have seen it in your mind. The knowledge... Legilimens!" Suddenly it felt as if Harry's head was breaking in two. Images flashed before his eyes, images of recent past. He was talking to Millie in the great hall. He was with his friends in the hidden room. He was kissing Padma. He was examining the map. He was doing research. He was casting spells. He was standing by the classroom. He was staring at the map. And then it stopped, except that the pain didn't. Dark spots were dancing before Harry's eyes, and he felt like throwing up. "Oh, but you are a most tiresome child, Potter," Crouch's voice said, and Harry opened his eyes, only then realizing they had been closed. "What? Now you deign to converse with me?" Crouch asked, in a sneer in his tone. "It's too late for that. I already know all I need to." Through immense effort, Harry raised his head to check what Crouch was doing. The restraints dug further into his arms, but he paid no heed. He saw Crouch holding the spell defense textbook in his hands and smiling giddily. "You won't need this infernal map any more, Potter." Crouch opened the book and stared at Harry's handiwork. Then he raised his wand and started muttering spells, probably trying to disengage the map from the book. "Are you working for Voldemort?" Harry asked, unable to contain the question. It was the only thing that made sense, except that it didn't make any sense, because Voldemort was... okay, maybe not dead, but certainly not alive. "Don't say the name!" Crouch raised his head and flicked his wand at Harry, scowling. "Don't you dare say the name, you filthy half-blood. Saviour, they call you. Soon there will be nobody to save you." Well, didn't that sound ominous? Harry opened his mouth to ask about the real Moody, but found that he couldn't talk. Fucking Crouch and his non-verbal spells. "Finally!" Crouch cried in triumph. Harry heard him move, and in a moment Crouch came into view, towering over Harry. In his hand he held the Marauder's map. "I'll find a good use for that," Crouch said, smiling. The magical eye whirled to look at, or maybe through, the classroom wall. "And you and your little friend need to get going, or people will start to wonder." Crouch's wand once again hovered over Harry's chest, then moved up to touch his forehead. "You, Potter, are too curious for your own good. It is too early for you to see my master's grand design." Harry sensed what was coming. Desperately, he tried to make his limbs move, to roll out of the way, to hide from the spell, but it was all for naught. "Obliviate. Prodo deceptionis." "Well, Harry, you know I've been telling you to go to a teacher for a while," Hermione said approvingly at the next impromptu meeting in the hidden room. "I'm glad you finally done it, because I really think we were getting in over our heads here. I'm sure Professor Moody will know what to do." "I'm a little surprised that Zabini went along with it," Anthony put in. "He wasn't for the idea before." "Yeah, well, Millie still thinks I shouldn't have done it." Harry shrugged and suppressed a wince at the motion. Honestly, the 6th-year Slytherins must have been more brutal during the last practice than he'd thought, because he was bruised all over. "Blaise agrees, though, and he was there when I told Professor Moody. I mean, there was no sense in hiding stuff from him, not after the map cleared him."
Neville shook his head. "It seems a little too easy, somehow," he said, smiling ruefully. "It was such a big deal, with us suspecting Professor Moody all of a sudden."
"Yeah, sorry about that. The thing with the Gillywood book, I mean—"
"No, you were right," Neville hastened to interrupt. "I should have told you where I'd got it from, but I'm glad that Moody was only trying to help you in the end. I would have felt awful if he'd been trying to kill you through me or something."
"Aw, shucks, it's going to be weird to see you without your nose in that map all the time, Harry," Terry said, smiling. Oh yes, Harry felt quite bereft without the map. Grimacing, he thought that he'd refrain from telling the twins about his decision to give it to Moody. He had a feeling they wouldn't approve in the slightest. He was already beginning to regret it himself.
"Professor Moody will have much better use for the map," Hermione asserted. "He said he'd show it to Professor Dumbledore, didn't he? They'll figure out something about Crouch very soon, you'll see."
Hermione's prediction came true in the sense that something did happen on the Crouch front, and something rather radical. A mere week after Harry gave Moody the map, the Daily Prophet reported that Petunius Crouch, head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation, had been found hanged in his own home, all clues pointing to suicide. "Figured we were investigating him, and he got cold feet, I expect," Moody said to Harry's tentative questions. "You don't think I hung him up, do you, laddie?" "Of course not, sir," Harry replied, but he was not so sure. He had the nagging feeling that something wasn't right about this whole picture, but he couldn't put his finger on what was bothering him exactly. Crouch's suicide didn't stay on the front page for a long time, however, because juicier news replaced it. Like Harry had feared, his breakup with Padma turned out to be highly entertaining material for the wizarding public. Rita Skeeter gleefully cast Harry in the role of a violent, spurned lover. A couple of other journalists went the other way and made him out to be the victim. Padma was bemused by the coverage in the beginning, but the further it got, the angrier she became. Terry whispered fearfully of hysterical outbursts in the Ravenclaw common room. By the end of the first week it could be gathered from the press that Harry was heartbroken and had brutally dumped Padma, and a twin sister had been involved too, and now he was taking out his temper on younger students, and he cried every night, and Padma was afraid of him, or maybe it was Pavati. Their names were treated as interchangeable synonyms. The Daily Prophet soon beat the Quibbler as far as inanity of their articles went.
"Don't worry, it's only a rack spurt that's got your brain. It will go away eventually." Harry had not complained to Luna. They weren't nearly close enough for him to let her in on his feelings. However, Harry found her serenity appealing as of late, because even his other friends weren't immune to the furore around him and Padma. And honestly, Neville's sympathy, mingled with pity, was in no way better than the twins' teasing. Harry got enough discussions on his life from the newspapers and other students. He understood why most of his friends treated him with the caution of handling a time-delayed bomb, but it didn't make him feel calmer. Luna didn't seem to be aware of the rumours at all. She blabbered on about the Naga infestation at the Yule Ball and the mysterious properties of something called the aged solar whisk, without a care to anything closer to home. And sometimes it was good to have a break from Blaze's pointed barbs, witty though they could be, and let Luna's nonsensical monologues wash over him. Flying was another reprieve. Harry had bumped into Cedric a few times on the Quidditch pitch when he'd gone flying to clear his head. The strain of the year had left its marks on Cedric too. The Hufflepuff had lost some of his usual cheer, and his smiles were obviously painted on for consumer benefit. Incongruously, he offered one of those automatic and painful fake grins to Harry the first time they saw each other on the Quidditch field. It took Cedric a while to snap out of it, while Harry stared at him in silence. Then the grin slid off Cedric's face, leaving behind a tired, slightly haunted expression. "When I volunteered for this, I thought it would be more about the tasks and the glory. But we're up on a freak show without off time. I don't even know how you deal." They didn't have a snitch to chase, and made do with walnuts and golf balls for a couple of weeks, until Krum came along, surely looking as always, with his own snitch and his own firebolt. Cedric was hopelessly outclassed on his Nimbus, so they switched brooms around to even the odds. Fleur was the only champion absent, but they never commented on it, like they never commented on the tournament anymore, because this was not about the tournament, or even about Quidditch.
Just a snitch, a sky, and a dash for freedom. The things none of them said would have been rendered empty by words, anyway. Words could only express so much, and there was certainly no vocabulary for the recent resentful sort of kinship they felt on account of the tournament. Too soon Victor's fan club followed after him, and suddenly their next pickup game wasn't fun, but a three-way match covered by the Daily Prophet. Famously, Harry Potter passed the first task by flying. One has to wonder to what extent Krum's jealousy prompted him to participate in the supposedly friendly match on Hogwarts grounds today. They never flew together after that again. Besides, the third task inched inevitably closer. The Quidditch pitch was soon closed off. In the last week of May, Bagman showed the maze to Harry, Cedric, Victor, and Fleur, one constantly by his nose to ward off flies of the muck heap nesting in his right nostril. The twins' curse was apparently still working, or maybe they were renewing it regularly. Harry was sure they had a lot of frustration to channel, especially with their brother Percy currently being under investigation in the Crouch suicide case. In the month leading up to the task, Harry had trained with unrelenting diligence, but when the day came, he did not feel at all prepared, even if he tried to look his most confident as he walked into the maze after Cedric. Harry and Cedric stood before the Triwizard Cup, staring at the trophy. It had taken them a long while to get there, and both sported numerous injuries. Harry's worst and most recent came from their fight with the spider, but Cedric had been subjected to Victor's cruciatus for a few seconds, which was a whole different level of disturbing. Harry was glad for taking his invisibility cloak into the maze with him. Rules be damned. He hadn't wanted to catch the eye of a murderous Krum, so he'd stunned the guy from where he'd stood a little way off, invisible, helped Cedric up, and shot red sparks for someone to come and collect the unhinged Bulgarian. And now, after what felt like hours of wandering the maze and encountering weird shit, he and Cedric stood side by side and looked at the gleaming trophy, which promised glory and worldwide recognition to the one who'd take it back. Harry tried to put his weight on the injured leg and winced at it as it throbbed in pain. "Go on, then," he said, trying not to sound bitter. "Take the cup." "No, you take it," Cedric countered. "I wouldn't have got past that acromantula if not for you. Cedric, there's no bloody way I'd beat you to the cup if we both ran towards it. So just go on and take it. You've won it fair and square." "It's not at all fair," Cedric said firmly. "You got injured while helping me. You could have just left me." Harry rolled his eyes. "Fine. How about we do it the Slytherin way, then? Duel for it." "And that's fair how? You're 14. "Don't write me off so quickly," Harry warned. "Upper-year Slytherins have been training me up all year, and I've learned a thing or two." Cedric raised a sceptical eyebrow. "Can you even duel with that leg?" "Hold on a sec. Meteor!" Sharp pain shot up his leg from the wound. Harry bit his lip as to avoid crying out. "Harry!" Cedric reached out to steady him as he wobbled. "What are you doing?" "Temporarily healing it," Harry forced through a wave of pain. "Hurts like hell, but I'll be mobile, though no marathon runner." "Aren't such spells a little—" Cedric cast around for a word. "They're not dark," Harry protested. "They're just unconventional. Nothing bad, anyway, and dead useful." Cedric shook his head, not looking particularly convinced. Harry tried putting his weight on his leg again, and sighed in relief as it didn't hurt all that much. "All good," he said. "Shall we, then?" They settled into duelling stances a few feet away from each other, and boy, wasn't it weird to face Cedric that way, and know that this wasn't a practice duel. Something actually depended on the outcome. They were competitors now. Not that Harry had ever seriously planned on winning the cup, but if there was a chance he could win it in a fight, instead of just have it granted to him, he'd totally take it. After all, he might not need more fame, but winning the Triwizard Tournament would be fame of a rather different kind than just being the boy who lived. It would prove that he was actually worth something, quite apart from the scar on his forehead. Expelliarmus! Cedric fired, opening the duel. Harry's shield was already up. The spell ricocheted off. Furunculus! Mulco! Stupefy! He cast in quick succession, hoping that at least one of the spells would hit. Protego! He added hastily, as Cedric's own stun sailed at him. There weren't any physical objects Harry could take cover behind. They were in an open clearing. This could prove unfortunate. Catalambano! Harry cast, hoping to catch Cedric in magical restraints. Cedric jumped out of the way, eyes a little wide. Commute Intella! He encountered hurriedly. Pello! His spells transfigured twigs on the ground into darts and banished them at Harry. Harry's shield deflected them, but he didn't have time to fire another spell before Cedric sent a curse flying at him, this time non-verbally. Harry maintained his shield, but he didn't like this, didn't like being forced on the defensive. He opted to dodge the next spell, so that he'd have a chance to fire a curse, and Cedric seemed to be transfiguring something else when Harry threw a confringo and forced him to roll out of the way, abandoning whatever transfiguration he'd been cooking up. Harry weighed the odds as his shield deflected the next curse. He was injured and beginning to tire, and Cedric was good, really good, actually. Harry would probably not win this, if it went on for a long time. However, Harry could have told, even before the duel had started, that Cedric was one of those quintessential nice guys who wouldn't expect any tricks and wouldn't pull any himself. Harry didn't even have to think about it. Jumping out of the way of the next curse, he wobbled intentionally, pretending to stumble on his wounded leg, and gave a sharp cry of pain. And being a nice, noble, wholesome guy, no matter what was at stake, Cedric hesitated. It was only a fraction of a second, but Harry had been waiting for it, and he shot a stunner before Cedric had the time to react. Cedric fell, frozen, onto the ground. Harry straightened, relief mingling with guilt in his chest. Pulling a trick on Cedric, who'd always been so kind to him, felt like betrayal, but fuck it, all was fair in a fight. If you weren't mentally ready, you were screwed. Harry walked over to Cedric and revived him. Constant vigilance, he said dryly. The other boy only stared at Harry in silence, though, as if seeing a stranger. Look, I'm not sorry, Harry insisted. You let your guard down during a duel, and it might have been a shitty thing of me to do, but you can't show weakness if you don't want it exploited. Merlin, Harry, was the cup so important to you? Cedric asked, and sounded genuinely hurt. Harry refused to back down. I would have done the same in any duel if I knew I couldn't defeat my opponent in a fair fight. You're too good for me. What did you expect me to do? Sit back and admit defeat? I don't know, but cheating is really not what I expected you to do. I didn't cheat, Harry stated, raising his chin. I tricked you. If I pulled the stunt on Professor Moody, he would have taken the moment to disarm me, but you hesitated. Whatever, Cedric shook his head. Just take the cub and let's get out of here. No, he stressed, seeing Harry's indecision. We're not having that discussion again. Whether you put your name in the goblet or not, you're going to win this tournament, Harry. Congratulations. Now take the fucking cup so that we can leave. Harry turned towards the trophy. This, right here, would be the end of his friendship with Cedric, whom he'd grown to like, damn it. Still, Harry didn't think he would have behaved differently if he had to duel Cedric again. He felt that he was right, that Cedric shouldn't have left himself so open to be messed with, that maybe it was underhanded of him, but all that dueling honor crap was a luxury. It didn't have place in a serious fight. Throwing one final glance at the other boy, Harry reached with his hand and touched the Triwizard Cup. The last thing he saw before disappearing in a whirl of colour and sound was the shocked look on Cedric's face. Bertha, you have served the master well, but we need you no longer. Master will have better servants soon. Avada Kedavra! Harry watched in panic as a jet of bright green light hit an empty-eyed woman who'd been stoking the fire under a large cauldron. She remained motionless on her knees for a long moment, and then fell sideways, like a marionette whose last strings had been cut. Harry knew this woman. He had seen her in a dream once, a horrifying nightmare he'd had last summer. Only then she had been lying in a pool of blood, but now she was here and alive, but already dead, and her killer was standing over her with a look of glee on his face, on Professor Moody's face, and Moody's face was suddenly shifting, morphing, twisting, into that of the man Harry had seen in that same dream, younger, less lined, with two perfectly healthy eyes. The magical eye popped out of his socket to roll onto the ground, and the wooden leg fell unheeded as a natural one grew in its place. Harry didn't understand. Bone of the father unknowingly given, flesh of the servant willingly given, blood of the enemy forcibly taken. Harry didn't even feel the pain of the gash on his arm, not really, consumed as he was by the horror of what he was seeing. A shriveled baby-like body in a cauldron, a man cutting off his own hand with a blissful expression on his face, and holy fuck, this was Voldemort trying to come back. And Harry had seen this baby before. He remembered this blackened, flaking skin. He'd been this baby in a dream once, and just what the fuck was... A tall, gaunt figure was rising out of the cauldron now, and Harry's scar erupted with pain greater than what he'd ever felt. "Harry Potter, we meet at last," Voldemort said. "I hope you appreciate the honor of being one of the first to learn of my return." Harry was terrified out of his mind. His thoughts were racing, and at the same time he didn't seem capable of thought at all, escape being his only and hopeless wish. And he couldn't help but cry out when Voldemort pressed a long pale finger to the curse scar. It had been aching like hell ever since he got to the graveyard, but this now was agony. "My faithful Death Eaters, some of you have been, of course, more faithful than others." Harry felt sick as he learned, along with 9 hooded figures who'd apparated into the graveyard, how Voldemort had encountered a noisy journalist in Albania, possessed her only to find that she held some invaluable information, and travelled back to England in her body. He learned how Voldemort had gone to free Barty Crouch Jr., Crouch's son, from the Imperius he'd been held under his own home for years. He learned how Crouch Jr. had helped Voldemort to acquire a rudimentary body in the most sick and perverted way, as Harry knew from the nightmare that he was now sure had shown reality. He learned how Crouch Jr. had polyjuiced into Mad-Eye Moody and put Harry's name in the goblet. He learned how the Imperius and brain-damaged Bertha Jorkins had become their puppet, taking care of Voldemort's weak body. He learned how Crouch had been deliberately helping Harry through the tournament. He learned, finally, how the portkey wards over Hogwarts would be lifted for the Triwizard winner, whom the cub would transport to the audience, and how Crouch had used that fact to subvert the portkey just so that this moment could happen. Summer solstice, the day of power and miraculous healing. There is nothing miraculous about my return. I have gone further than any other man to achieve immortality. Voldemort had planned, slowly and meticulously. He'd been patient. He'd known that this ritual of rebirth needed to happen on the day of the summer solstice. So he'd waited. He'd known that, in the aftermath of the failed attack on Godric's Hollow, Dumbledore had retrieved Voldemort's wand. The Dark Lord had therefore sent his most trusted servant to Hogwarts, not only to sabotage the tournament, but also to steal the wand from the headmaster's office and bring it back. The plan had taken a whole year to unfold, but it had succeeded, and Voldemort did not appear to be a reckless man. He smiled coldly and spoke of immortality in the voice of a man assured of having an eternity ahead of him. A year did not matter on the grand scheme of things. He was here now, and he had Harry at his mercy now, and Harry really didn't want to die. "Untie him, Bartemius, and give him his wand. Let us grant to the last Potter a chance to die fighting." And fuck, he couldn't hope to trick Voldemort into losing. "We should bow to each other, Harry. I said bow." "Protego," Harry muttered, without thinking. The shield deflected whatever spell Voldemort had been aiming at him, no doubt to humiliate him further somehow. "Crucio!" came Voldemort's enraged hiss, and Harry tried to dodge out of the way, knowing there was no blocking this curse, but it was too late, and he fell, consumed by unbearable pain. All his nerves caught on fire. It felt as if he was burning and being cut, and his head would burst from agony. He could hardly think. He was surely dying. "Now, that was just a taste," Voldemort said pleasantly from somewhere above Harry. The pain ended, but its aftershock still coursed through Harry's body. Harry lay on the ground, panting and trying to collect himself. "You don't want me to torture you again, do you, Harry? Would you like me to just kill you with the next curse?" Harry got up, slowly, gripping a gravestone to drag himself up. He tried to tune out Voldemort's taunting and come up with any sort of viable escape plan, if such a thing was at all possible, which it probably wasn't. "Answer me, Potter. Imperio!" The pain from Harry's injuries retreated. He was left with a nice, comfortable, floating feeling. Everything was all right, or would be soon, if he only listened to the voice in his head. "Beg for your life," the voice urged silkily. "Beg nicely, beg prettily, and maybe he will let you go." The voice sounded very trustworthy, but Harry doubted it still somehow. "Just say please," the voice spoke, more firmly. "Say please. Please, no." No, Harry thought, discomfited. There was something not right here. What was he supposed to be saying please about? "Just say it." "No," Harry cried out, and suddenly reality slammed back into him. He was at the graveyard again, racked with pain, and the voice in his mind was gone, and everything was clear now. Voldemort's face was livid. "No?" he asked, softly. The Death Eaters who had been jeering before now fell almost fearfully silent. "You dare defy me again, Harry?" But Harry wasn't interested in listening to him. He knew it wouldn't be long before Voldemort fired the third and final unforgivable, and he wasn't about to let it happen. With a burst of strength, he darted behind the tomb he'd been tied to. He'd suddenly remembered he still had his invisibility cloak with him, and if there was ever a need to use it, it was now. A curse chipped the tombstone just above Harry's head. Hastily, Harry took the cloak from out of his pocket and put it on. He couldn't apparate, he didn't have a broom, but at least they wouldn't see him now. The invisibility cloak covered him completely, and he'd silenced his steps with a whispered spell. "Are you going to hide from me, Harry? Are you going to play the coward?" The Death Eaters laughed. Harry gritted his teeth. Cautiously, and almost forgetting to breathe from nervousness, Harry started creeping away. There were houses looming in the distance, some buildings, probably a village. A church was closest to the graveyard, so Harry figured he could maybe hide in it, or behind it, or something. "This is getting tedious, Harry. Come out from behind the tomb. I thought you would want to die in battle with your head held high, not slaughtered like a snivelling child." "You thought wrong," Harry snarled mentally. "I don't want to die at all." He was a good way away from Voldemort already, and nearing the fence separating the graveyard from the church, when he heard a noise that still had stilled his heart. "Master, he is escaping. He is invisible." Of course, the snake. Harry made a few more cautious steps, looking around. He was in an open space now, away from the tall tombstones. "Your little charade is up, Potter," Voldemort said, his voice very, very cold, and Harry somehow knew that Voldemort could now tell where he was. He turned around, still under the cloak, gripping his wand but afraid to give himself away with the spell if Voldemort didn't yet know. Voldemort remained where he had been, but he was facing Harry now and looking right at the spot where Harry stood, invisible. Pain burst forth from Harry's scar the moment his and Voldemort's eyes met. "Avada Kedavra," Harry whispered, feeling numb, wand aimed at those gleaming red eyes, and Voldemort laughed, his voice echoing eerily around the graveyard as he stepped out of the way of pale green light. Voldemort's own killing curse sped towards Harry. Harry dodged, rolled out of the way of another, still under the cloak, clenching his teeth against the pain in his leg and his scar, and right there, with his cheek against young grass and dry soil, he realized suddenly, without a trace of doubt, that he was going to die. He was going to die, even though he was only 14, and had so much life yet to live, and was not at all ready. The Death Eaters and their taunts, the graveyard, the pain, all of it melted into the background now. It was not important. The world became condensed to the rapid beating of Harry's heart, the smell of fresh night air, and the magnetic pull of Voldemort's crimson eyes. He forced himself up. Harry was standing upright, still uselessly clutching the invisibility cloak over himself with frozen fingers, when the Dark Lord's killing curse hit him squarely in the chest. He saw bright green light, heard the soft rush of death. Then, nothing.